Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about proving parentage. In family history, in order to prove the identity of anybody in our family tree, we know that we are looking for information about the events in their life, their birth, their marriage, their death, maybe military service or occupational information. But one of the key pieces of identifying information about any individual is also their relationships. What makes a person unique out of anybody in the world is not necessarily their name or their birth date and place. You could have a lot of people with the same name, born in the same place, around the same time. What helps to make a person unique in all the world is their relationships. Who are their parents? Who did they marry? Who are they the parent of? And so today we're going to talk specifically about proving parentage. We're going to talk about some records that explicitly state parentage. We'll talk about how we can infer parentage from other types of records. And then I'll wrap up with an example from my own family history about how I came to a conclusion about the parentage of one of my own ancestors, and the proof summary I'll share with you that I wrote that helps prove that out. So let's go ahead and dive in. First, let me just start with a reminder about the genealogical proof standard. This is going to be really important for those of you who are new to family history to become familiar with this and how this works. For those of you who've been doing family history for a long time, it's a great refresher. These are the 5 steps of the genealogical proof standard. The first one is a reasonably exhaustive search. The second is that we're making complete and accurate source citations. The third is the correlation and analysis of evidence. The fourth is the resolution of conflicting evidence. And then the fifth is that proof summary, or that soundly reasoned, coherently written conclusion. You'll hear me talking about these things as we go through this concept today, and I just wanted you to see a map of how these things lay out in relationship to one another. So let's talk about those documents or records that explicitly state relationships, these explicitly stated relationships. The first and probably one of the most important or vital records for proving parentage are vital records. Vital records are defined as birth, marriage, and death records specifically. So a birth certificate most often is going to explicitly state who the parents are of this individual. Sometimes it might only list the mother. The father's name might be left off. A marriage certificate or a marriage record sometimes will list the parents of both the bride and the groom. Sometimes it will just list the father. Death records very often will list both the names of the father and the mother. Sometimes you'll even get information about their birth location. Just like on a birth certificate, sometimes you'll get not just their name, but their age at the time that that child was born. So vital records are a really great resource where you can say, definitively, this explicitly states the relationship between this child and these parents, okay? Another type of record that explicitly, where the relationship is explicitly stated, is the census records. In the U.S., those are the 1880 through 1940 census. Now keep in mind, this only lists the relationship of the individuals in the household to the head of household, okay? So if the head of household is a man and he has listed a wife and 6 children, okay, it is explicitly stated that those children are his sons or daughters, but you cannot assume necessarily the relationship to that wife or to that woman. She might be the mother of some, all, or none of those children. So just something to keep in mind as you're looking at census records. In the UK and Canada, they started listing relationship to head of household in their 1851 census records. Another record that explicitly states the relationship, oftentimes of children to parents, are wills. So if somebody leaves a will, they very often will state, to my child or to my daughter or to my son, I leave this. Sometimes you'll even get relationships to grandchildren. You'll see things like to the children of my daughter so-and-so, and you'll see explicit relationships stated in that type of a record. One of my favorite records for relationships is obituaries. Again, you end up with these explicitly stated relationships that often say, that they are predeceased by their parents, and it will list parents' names. Sometimes it will even list grandparents' names. And they're survived by, and then it will list the names of their children and sometimes even their grandchildren. So you get a lot of really great relationship information out of those type of records. An often overlooked type of record that explicitly states relationships is newspapers. Not necessarily full-blown articles. And a lot of times when I start talking about newspapers, some people think, oh, well, my ancestor wasn't important enough. They never did anything scandalous. There was never a newspaper article written about them. And that may be true. But a lot of communities wrote what I call blurbs, the town news. And sometimes it's just a one column in a larger newspaper for a larger area, but it'll list things like Mrs. John Smith went to visit her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Williams, in another town this week. And so now you have an explicitly stated relationship between Mrs. Smith and her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Williams. So don't overlook those little newspaper blurbs or those little community highlights, because very often those may be the only place where some of these explicitly stated relationships exist. Keep in mind that birth records, particularly here in the United States, are a fairly new phenomenon. A lot of states did not start keeping birth records until the early 1900s. So when you start getting into research into the 1800s and even back into the 1700s, sometimes those wills or those newspaper blurbs might be the only place where there is an explicitly stated relationship between those parents and those children. Let's talk now about places where you can go to find information about inferred relationships. And here's what I mean by that. There may be very well cases in your family history that you run into very quickly as you get into family history research where there is not a single document that lists the name of the parents of an individual. And so you have to start looking for other types of documents or other types of relationships that will help you infer who the parents are. So, for example, one of the most popular record sets that we use to infer relationships, again, are census records. From 1850 to 1870 in the United States, every person in the household was listed on the census. The challenge, however, is that there is no relationship listed between the individuals in that household. So you oftentimes can look at it and you can infer, if you've got two adults and then a house full of children, that those are a set of parents and a set of children. But you can't definitively say that. I have one example in my own family history where I found a group of people in the 1870 census, two adults, a male and a female, a household full of children. All the ages worked out that this was a particular family. And so I made the assumption that this was a family and I put them into my database. Now, I put them in my database with a lot of tentativeness and some questions, and my tree is a working tree. It is not a conclusion tree. And so I went looking for additional evidence to support these inferred relationships. And I could not find this family in the 1860 census, nor could I find them in the 1880 census with the structure or the familial makeup that I expected based on what I had found in that 1870 census. Additional research proved that this was actually a brother and a sister. So this head of household and his wife and the woman were actually a brother and a sister. And the children that were living in the household were actually their nieces and nephews from 3 different families. So what had happened is the grandparents in this scenario had passed away, and they had left the family property to all of their children held jointly. And so the 2 single siblings, the 2 single siblings lived on the property and took care of it, and the married siblings sent their children, their teenage children and their older children, to come and work the farm with their aunt and uncle. And so again, we can infer sometimes those relationships based on the makeup of that household, but it's not explicitly stated, so we have to be really cautious about making assumptions and make sure we're looking for additional evidence. Now, in England, that 1841 census is in the same situation, where you have every member of the household listed, but relationships are not listed. What this also means for those of you who have trees on Ancestry or in Family Tree Maker is that if you're trying to attach one of these records, 1850, 1860, 1870 census, you're going to have to attach that record one by one to every member of the household because there's no relationships listed. So our computers don't know, oh, this is a father and a mother and their children, because we don't know. Whereas from 1880 on, when you're attaching a census record to a household, it will attach it, if you request it, to every member of the household all at once. So that's just a little tip about why that might work a little differently than what you expected. Another great tool for inferred relationships is tombstones and grave placement in a cemetery. Tombstones a lot of times will list couples, for example, on a shared tombstone. And it might not list that they were married, but the fact that they share a tombstone means you can infer some kind of a relationship. Again, you could be looking at siblings, you could be looking at cousins, or you could be looking at a husband and a wife. And so if you knew the name of one parent and you were looking for the name of the other, that tombstone might share or give you further light into that information. Grave placement is also a really big deal. And that's why I'm so thrilled that the new Find a Grave app for mobile devices actually geotags the specific location of a tombstone when I take a photograph of it and then upload it to Find a Grave. Because knowing exactly where graves are in relationship to each other in a cemetery can help me infer some relationships. So just because somebody's buried next to somebody with a completely different last name doesn't mean they're not related. They could be in-laws. They could be a brother and his sister with her married name on her tombstone. It could be a set of children with their mother, and she's using the last name of her third husband, right? So where people are buried, and a lot of times people are going to be buried in these family plots or family groups in a cemetery, plotting that out and knowing where those graves are exactly can help you start to recognize some of the relationships between these people. Again, obituaries, I put this in both categories for a couple of reasons. One is that obituaries sometimes will explicitly state relationships. These are the parents of the deceased, these are the children of the deceased. However, sometimes you need to work around the family in order to come to a conclusion. And here's what I mean by that. My grandfather's death certificate, for example, and his obituary, neither of them state the names of his parents. And that's because his third wife, who gave the information to that was provided on the death certificate, and then that information that was used to write the obituary, she did not know the name of his parents. She'd never met them. They were long gone before she came along and married my great-grandfather. So none of his records lists the name of his parents. However, I do have a couple of records that explicitly list him as the brother of these other people who passed away. So I have his brother's obituary, and it says he was predeceased by, and it lists my great-grandfather by name. And in that same obituary, it lists the name of the parents. Okay, so because I know he's the brother, and I know these are the brother's parents, I can infer the relationship between my great-grandfather and his parents. And there's a lot of different kinds of records where you can make those connections if you connect with siblings and nieces and nephews and aunts and uncles. If you make sure that you're doing all of that collateral research, the records of your ancestor might not explicitly state those relationships, but the records of their other family members may. Now, probate records are a huge thing, and probate records are not just wills, though wills are included as part of a probate record. But probate records include a lot more information. For example, if someone died without a will but had property, that property would still need to go through probate after they died to be dispersed appropriately to family members. So we end up with these probate files, and Ancestry is currently in the process of digitizing probate records from across the United States, ready for to be put online in the coming months, and that's really exciting. So we have these probate records that have guardianship papers and wills and estate inventories and court documents back and forth, and very often you'll start to see executors being appointed and guardians being appointed, and the relationships between these people start to become a little bit apparent, even though they might not be explicitly stated, as you put the pieces of this puzzle together through, the probate file that could be 120 pages and have taken 20 years, or could just be 5 or 6 pages and taken two months. Okay, really great records. I mentioned sibling relationships, pay close attention in the census. Who are the siblings that are listed on a census record? Who are the siblings that are listed in an obituary? What are some of those relationships between those people? And that's going to be really important because, again, their record might state the relationship even if your ancestors' record does not. Now, let me just give you some tips and tricks and some cautions. We've talked about some of them, but the first one is that stated doesn't mean accurate. Okay? So just because somebody is listed on a census record and it explicitly states that they are the daughter of the head of household does not mean that that record is true. Okay? It could be that they're the child of the wife from her first marriage, and just the way it was told to the census taker is the way it was written, and he's really not the father. Same thing even with birth, marriage, and death records. Sometimes we tend to give more credence to birth, marriage, and death records, but the reality is that if it's a death record, that death record could be completely inaccurate. I have a death record in my possession where the names of the parents written on the death record are actually the names of the parents of the informant, not the parents of the deceased. Okay, so just because a record explicitly states who the parents are does not mean that record is accurate. That takes us back to that concept in the genealogical proof standard of a reasonably exhaustive search. You cannot rely on just a single record. You need to make sure you're collecting all the records. Make sure that you're looking at them all. And if you've got a record that says one thing and another record that says something else, make sure that you can figure out why that conflicting evidence exists. This is particularly important when you're trying to identify the maiden names of mothers, right? What is the identity of that mother? One sibling may list one name and one sibling may list another name on death certificates, and then your ancestor may list nothing, and you're trying to put the pieces of this puzzle together. Well, it could be that all of the siblings have different mothers, or it could be that at the time that the one sibling died, the mother was married to someone else, and so she had a different last name. Lots of different reasons, but you have to be able to explain those reasons. And if you can't explain those reasons, usually it means there's more research to be done. Now, I mentioned this, and it bears repeating often, and that is you need to explore both laterally, those siblings, and multi-generationally. Look at grandchildren, look at aunts and uncles. Oftentimes, the piece of information that you're looking for could be just from one of those other branches of the family. And you'll build your own brick walls if you're not willing to explore those a little bit further. Another great resource for proving parentage is Ancestry DNA testing. If you have not yet been involved in Ancestry DNA testing, I would highly encourage you to do that. Whether you have brick walls in your tree or not, it does help prove that parentage. A lot of times the paper trail lies. We think we have our tree built out. We think we've been climbing the right tree, only to take a DNA test and discover that, our grandfather's father, who's listed on his birth certificate, not really his father. And people lie, records lie, but DNA doesn't lie. And so DNA helps us not just prove that our paper trail and the conclusions we've drawn are correct, but if we do have some of those brick walls, it can also help us make some breakthroughs in that area. And that's exciting to me. I've been able to do that in my own tree, both of those things, both prove that my paper trail is accurate and also break through some of those brick walls to prove that these are the parents, not these people, in the case of one of those brick walls. So let me just share with you one of my own summaries that I've come to. So I have this ancestor, Matthew Shipman, and I have an uncle who had done a lot of research into this family. He had identified very clearly the father of Matthew Shipman as Jacob Shipman. However, identifying Matthew's mother proved to be a little bit trickier. Lots of family stories, even things that had been published in family histories for decades. In the family history library, there were published volumes that listed Jacob's wife variably as Sarah McMinn or Sarah Kuykendall. Sarah McMinn seemed to be winning, right? Sometimes we think, 20 trees or 20 published family histories say this thing, and there's only one that says this thing. And so, 20 is more than one, therefore, right? And that's not an accurate way to do that. But a lot of times we fall into that trap. And so the question, of course, was then, who is Matthew's mother? Is it possible that Jacob was married multiple times? Who was his mother? Who was Jacob married to at the time that Matthew was born? So a lot of research went into this. A lot of records were put together, but I will read to you, and I'll have it here on the screen in just a minute, my conclusion. And this conclusion was not come to independently. Not only did I do a lot of research into varying records, used a lot of inferences from records that I was able to find, but there were also probably a dozen other researchers who were working on this, and they also helped collect some of this information and come to some of these conclusions. And so once we finally decided that Sarah Kuykendall was in fact the mother of Matthew Shipman, this is the explanation for why we came to that conclusion. Okay, because the decision was between Sarah Kuykendall and Sarah McMinn. So this is the proof statement. It'll take a couple of slides to read. After Jacob Shipman died, his widow, Sarah, so we knew her first name was Sarah, his widow Sarah married George Sailing and moved to Tennessee and then further westward. Before she married George Sailing as Jacob's widow, so she was still listed as Sarah Shipman, it's a bit of a tongue twister, she sold a parcel of 300 acres of land in Buncombe County, North Carolina, which is now Henderson County, to Jacob's brother Edward Shipman. Okay? The reason that's important is because the deed was witnessed by Abraham Kuykendall. Okay? So that we're looking for names that come up in records that connect individuals or family members. Jacob received the land as a land grant back in the 1790s. Jacob's brother Edward also had entered for a grant at about the same time in 1796 for 150 acres. And his 150 acres was just a little bit below where Abraham Kuykendall lived at the time. And it included some logs that James Burleson had cut for a cabin. And all of this was in the paperwork, the land paperwork. Okay? That's important because James Burleson was Jacob and Sarah's son-in-law. So you're starting to see connections between these family members. So we've got Jacob has land, Edward has land, James has land, and Abraham has land, and that land is all connected, okay? And we know the relationship between Jacob and Edward as brothers. We know the relationship between Jacob and James as father-in-law and son-in-law. And so is Abraham completely unrelated to these individuals, or is there a reason that he lives there around them, okay? So very often, particularly when you get back into the early 1800s, or early 1800s, late 1700s, people are moving in family groups. There's some connection between these people. There's very rarely just some random unrelated individual who's living near these people. Another grant for Edward Shipman in 1801 described his land described this land as adjacent, and all three of these tracts of land are described as on the waters of Mud Creek. And all of these deeds are in the vicinity of Abraham Kuykendall's land. It's also important to note that this Mud Creek area, which is not very big, is where both Jacob Shipman and Abraham Kuykendall are buried. Simon Kuykendall, who witnessed Jacob Shipman's will, is the son of Abraham Kuykendall. So again, we've got some connection between these family members. In Franklin County, Tennessee, 3 sons and a son-in-law of Abraham Kuykendall of Buncombe County, North Carolina, sold a parcel of land that they received as legatees of Abraham Kuykendall. It was recorded in 1814, and the name of the son-in-law on that sale was George Sailing. Now, the signature says his wife signed it for him, okay? Apparently, probably because either he was not present at the time or maybe because he could not read or write. And George Sailing, or Sailing, is listed as the son-in-law of Abraham Kuykendall, which means that George's wife is the daughter of Abraham Kuykendall. And we know that Jacob Shipman's widow married George Sailing. Okay? So that, putting together all of those relationships, even though there is nothing that explicitly states that Jacob Shipman married Sarah Kuykendall, or that Sarah Kuykendall is the mother of Matthew Shipman or any of the other children of Jacob Shipman, we can still make this inference because of the connection of all of these records. Additionally, Jacob and Sarah Shipman's children are all named either after Jacob's family names or Abraham's family names. And then finally, Abraham Kuykendall's daughter Jane married a man named Robert McMinn. And Robert McMinn is the only McMinn in the area. And their daughter Sarah, we can track her. She married a Scion Blythe. They moved to Texas. Okay? So Sarah McMinn cannot be the wife of Jacob Shipman because we can track her living an entirely different life with an entirely different husband in an entirely different place. And there is no proof that there was another Sarah in the family of Robert McMinn. Therefore, the wife of Jacob Shipman is most likely Sarah Kuykendall, daughter of Abraham Kuykendall, and we've proved, at least to my satisfaction, the parentage of Matthew. Now, we did all of that research before Ancestry DNA testing, and so I need to add some additional information to this proof summary, which is that I now have genetic matches to other children besides Sarah of Abraham Kuykendall in my Ancestry DNA cousin matches. And that's really exciting to me because it helps to prove out or shore up this information or this theory about the parentage of Matthew. So that's a really complicated case, right? Lots of your cases are going to be a little bit more simple, a little easier to manage looking through those records, but it is possible, even as we get back into the 1700s, to prove some of those relationships with the documentation as we put it together, as we put families together, as we connect the dots through some of those inferred records. That is all I have prepared for you today. If you've got any questions about proving parentage, please feel free to leave a comment on the YouTube channel. We'll check those out, respond as necessary. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.